It began on a quiet September evening in California's Central Valley. A fisherman stood on the edge of the Burns Cut, a narrow offshoot of the Stockton River that wound its way through the farmland east of Stockton. He had come there, as he often did, to find peace, to cast his line into the slow brown water and forget the noise of the world for a while. But that night, the river gave him something else entirely. When the tug came, it was heavier than usual, as if something were fighting against him from below. He reeled it in, hand over hand, the line trembling under its own weight. Then the shape appeared, a dark, waterlogged plastic bag, knotted tightly. He pulled it closer, curious at first, and then the curiosity drained from him in an instant. Inside the bag was a human leg. By dawn, the quiet riverbank had become a crime scene. Deputies in rain boots waded through the shallows as detectives walked the edges with flashlights, scanning for more. The water shimmered with debris, and every ripple seemed to hide another secret. Before the morning was over, the river gave up what it had been keeping. 2 arms bound together with masking tape, a torso wrapped in a bedsheet, and finally, a head. The man who arrived to oversee it all was Detective Armando Mayoya of the Stockton County Sheriff's Office, a calm presence in a case that already defied reason. Even for a man accustomed to tragedy, what he saw that day was something else. For someone to take the time to dismember a person, he would later say, and to transport that person in different bags and just dispose of the body without caring, it's callous and it's cold. At the morgue, the fingerprint match gave the body a name. Sammy McCullough, a 40-year-old catfish farmer who also dealt small amounts of marijuana. He wasn't rich, nor was he powerful. He wasn't the kind of man who made enemies easily. Yet someone had shot him point blank in the forehead with a .22 caliber rifle, and then, as if to erase him from existence, carved his body apart with a serrated knife. Detectives followed what little trail they had: a wallet in the river, a pair of jeans, a Jeep Cherokee, freshly washed, its carpets still damp. The pieces didn't fit, but they were enough to form a picture of someone who knew what they were doing, who had the patience and discipline of a hunter. But what no one knew then was that this quiet stretch of California farmland had just become the starting point of one of the most extraordinary manhunts in American history, a chase that would span mountains, deserts, and the deepest canyons of the Southwest. This is how the story of Danny Ray Horning began, a man who would soon be known to the world as the prison break genius. Detective Armando Mayoya knew that in cases like this, killers often left behind something, a single mistake, a fragment, a trace of routine that betrayed control. When his team entered McCullough's home on East Mariposa Road, the place looked almost ordinary. The lights still worked. The television sat quietly in the corner. In the kitchen, dishes were stacked neatly in the sink. But it was the silence, not the mess, that unsettled them most. At first glance, there was nothing to see. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no pools of blood. It didn't look like a murder scene. Then, as the deputies swept their flashlights through the bathroom, something small caught the light. It shimmered faintly beneath the drain, a speck no bigger than a grain of rice. Mayoya crouched closer. What he saw made his stomach tighten. It wasn't metal. It wasn't glass. It was bone, human bone. When the plumbers pulled the pipe apart, they found what the water had tried to hide: blood, tissue, and hair clotted in the trap. Someone had used this bathtub to take a life apart. The coroner's report confirmed the horror. McCullough had been shot at point-blank range, killed instantly, and then dismembered with a kitchen knife, the same kind of serrated blade, missing from a cutlery set found on the counter. The man had been carved up in his own home, with his own tools. Detectives began to piece together who might have wanted him dead. McCullough was known around Stockton as a quiet man, though not entirely clean. He sold small quantities of marijuana to fishermen and farmers. He kept cash hidden around the property, a habit that made him both popular and vulnerable. 2 years earlier, he'd been robbed at gunpoint by a pair of local men. The leader of that robbery was a name Mayoya hadn't heard in years: Stephen Horning. Stephen was one of 5 brothers from a rough family on the outskirts of town. But it wasn't Stephen who interested Mayoya. It was the brother everyone in Stockton seemed to whisper about, Danny Ray Horning. When detectives interviewed the oldest Horning brother, Timothy, the pieces began to fall into place. He told them the brothers were inseparable, especially Danny and Stephen, and that they'd spent years hunting and fishing along the same river where McCullough's body was found. He described Danny in ways that felt more like warnings than memories. A man who could skin a deer in minutes, who cleaned with almost surgical precision, and who never flinched at the sight of blood. Then came a story that froze the room. Timothy recalled the day Danny had shot a deer, dragged it into the bathroom, and dismembered it in the tub. He'd wrapped the remains in plastic bags, cleaned the drain, and scrubbed the tiles until they gleamed. Mayoya didn't need to hear more. The similarities were too close to ignore. The killer of Sam McCullough hadn't just mimicked that scene, he had repeated it. Armed with a search warrant, deputies went to the Hornings' property, a small trailer sitting behind their parents' home. Danny was nowhere to be found. The yard was overgrown, littered with beer cans and rusted tools. Then, near the fence line, one deputy noticed something strange. The stock of a rifle, broken clean in two. Tests confirmed it was a Westernfield .22 caliber rifle, the same model used to kill McCullough. In the dirt next to the trailer, the detectives found something else, a freshly disturbed patch of soil, as if something had been buried recently. When they dug it up, they found the body of the family pet, a dog. Inside its skull was a single bullet, also .22 caliber. Ballistic tests matched that bullet to the same weapon that killed McCullough. It was as if Danny Horning had left behind a rehearsal, a test of cruelty before the real act. Within hours, Stephen Horning was arrested for questioning. He denied everything, but as the evidence stacked up, he broke. He told detectives that Danny had once sworn revenge on McCullough for sending him to prison after that first robbery. And he added something else, something that made the detectives stop writing for a moment. Danny Ray Horning, he said, had just been released from prison 3 months before the murder. His conviction was child molestation. Mayoya knew then that this wasn't a man driven by money or panic. It was something colder, more profound, a kind of rage that doesn't burn out. But by the time they pieced it all together, Danny Ray Horning had vanished. For a year, his name would sit buried in case files, his face fading on wanted posters, until one spring morning, hundreds of miles away, he would walk into a small-town bank with a loaded pistol, and his story would begin again. This is how the man they called the Butcher of Stockton became something far more dangerous, a fugitive with a plan. On a cool March morning in 1991, the small desert town of Winslow, Arizona, stirred to life as it always did. Slow, quiet, unremarkable. The Valley National Bank sat at the corner of 2nd Street, a squat building with tinted windows that reflected the fading blue of the sky. Just before noon, the doors swung open and a man walked in. He was calm, dressed simply, carrying nothing that suggested danger except for the dark weight in his eyes and the pistol in his hand. His name was Danny Ray Horning, and in the next few minutes, he would change the course of his life forever. He spoke to the manager, his voice steady as he handed her a duffel bag and instructed her to fill it with cash. There was a strange mechanical composure, the kind that made witnesses uncertain whether to be terrified or impressed. Behind the counter, the teller moved quickly, slipping bundles of bills into the bag while, under the desk, her trembling hand pressed the silent alarm. 2 minutes later, Detective Elmer Hassey of the Winslow Police Department stepped out of his unmarked car and looked through the glass doors of the bank. Inside, Horning was backing toward the exit with one arm locked tightly around a hostage, the gun pressed to their side. As he stepped outside, sunlight cutting across his face, Hassey closed the distance and raised his weapon. The confrontation lasted no longer than a heartbeat. The bag fell to the pavement, the hostage ran for cover, and Horning found himself staring down the barrel of the law. At the station, officers ran his name through the national database. The system froze for a moment before producing a single result: wanted for murder in Stockton, California. In that instant, what had seemed like a routine bank robbery became something else entirely: the resurfacing of a killer who had vanished without a trace more than a year earlier. Back in California, Detective Armando Mayoya received the call that would reopen his case. The Arizona detectives reported that Horning had been arrested with a 9mm pistol in his possession, and the serial number etched into the gun's body matched one of the weapons stolen from Sammy McCullough's home. The final link was complete. Horning was convicted of armed robbery, assault, and kidnapping. During sentencing, he stood before the judge and, with a half-smile, dared the court to impose the maximum penalty. He promised that no matter how long they intended to keep him behind bars, he would not stay. It was not a boast shouted in defiance, but a calm declaration from a man who believed entirely in his own ability to bend fate to his will. The judge accepted the challenge and sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms in Arizona's Florence State Prison, one of the most secure facilities in the country, a place built to hold men who had long since abandoned hope. In the months that followed, Horning became invisible. He took a job as a janitor in the infirmary, where he mopped floors, collected trash, and cleaned the kitchen at the end of each day. He was courteous to the guards, quiet among the inmates, and careful never to draw attention to himself. But with each shift, he was building something, not with tools or blueprints, but with patience. He collected fragments of freedom: a white lab coat from the infirmary, a pair of kitchen trousers borrowed from another inmate, and an identification badge left unattended on a desk. He waited, watching and memorizing schedules and patrol routes, until opportunity felt less like chance and more like design. On the afternoon of May 12, 1992, the guards began their routine 4 o'clock head count. When they reached Horning's cell, they found the bed neatly made, the walls untouched, and the man himself gone. There was no tunnel, no breach, no sign of struggle, just a space where order had once been. Somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, dressed in a white coat and carrying the calm of a man who had already rehearsed his escape 100 times in his mind, Danny Ray Horning walked out of Florence State Prison and into the open desert. By nightfall, helicopters combed the sky while search teams on horseback traced faint footprints across the sand. Dogs caught the scent and lost it again. Every direction looked the same: endless dust, low shrubs, and the pale shimmer of heat rising off the earth. 3 days later, a rancher west of Florence returned home to find his farmhouse ransacked. Clothes were missing, food was gone, and a revolver had vanished from a drawer. And on the window frame, investigators found a fingerprint that confirmed what they already feared. Horning had been there. The FBI assumed control of the investigation, turning it into what would soon be called the most extensive search in Arizona's history. They believed Horning was heading north, back to Winslow, perhaps to seek revenge on the officers who had arrested him. But Horning was not driven by rage or impulse. He was calculating, deliberate, and already moving in the opposite direction. The desert around Florence stretches endlessly in every direction, a landscape of silence and shimmering heat where even footprints vanish by morning. For most men, it would be a prison without walls, but for Danny Ray Horning, it was freedom in its purest form. He had promised the court he would escape, and now, walking alone beneath the white sun with nothing but stolen clothes and the echo of his own breath, he had done exactly that. For days, he moved unseen through dry riverbeds and mesquite scrub, following back roads and cattle trails that few people ever noticed. At night, he broke into empty farmhouses, eating what he could find, drinking from garden hoses, and taking the kind of things only a man who planned to survive would take: binoculars, matches, ammunition, and maps. He slept on porches, in barns, and sometimes beneath the open stars. He was a hunter again, and the world had become his wilderness. When the first reports reached the Arizona Department of Corrections, disbelief quickly turned to panic. Florence was supposed to be impenetrable. Yet a convicted murderer had walked through its gates in daylight wearing a disguise so ordinary that no one thought to stop him. The prison went into lockdown as law enforcement from across the state mobilized. Within hours, the FBI had joined the effort, setting up roadblocks and aerial patrols, their radios alive with the sound of coordinates and static. But Horning was already far beyond their reach. To the public, his escape was terrifying. To the men hunting him, it was humiliating. But to Horning himself, it was a test of endurance, a private war against the system that had confined him. Rumors spread through the state of sightings in abandoned cabins, of campsites found deep in the pines, of food stolen from vacation homes. The newspapers called him a ghost. Some even gave him a name, Rambo. The comparison came easily. Like the fictional soldier from the films, Horning seemed unstoppable, a lone man outwitting hundreds of officers, vanishing each time they drew close. By early June, his trail led north toward the Mogollon Rim, a stretch of forest where mountains met sky. The terrain was treacherous, with steep ridges, cold nights, and sudden storms. But Horning thrived in this environment. He broke into cabins when he needed supplies, leaving behind notes that mocked the officers chasing him. In one, he thanked the absent homeowners for their generosity. In another, he signed his name like an outlaw from a century earlier. The tone of those notes revealed what Horning had begun to understand, that he was no longer just a fugitive. He was becoming a story, one that the media could not resist. Each newspaper headline, each television broadcast, turned him into something larger than life. To some, he became a symbol of rebellion, a man who defied authority and survived on his wits. To others, he was a dangerous predator haunting the woods. The truth was somewhere in between, and even Horning seemed unsure which version of himself he wanted to believe. Weeks passed, and still he eluded them. In the small towns along the rim, people locked their doors and whispered his name like a myth. This is how a convicted murderer became a ghost in the Arizona wilderness, a man whose flight blurred the line between reality and legend. Initially, most officers believed the chase would end quickly. They assumed exhaustion or hunger would force Horning to surrender, that a week in the desert would break him down. But Horning was not an ordinary fugitive. For a public wary of politics and authority, Horning became a dark folk hero, a man who had beaten the system, living freely in the open country. At the same time, hundreds of armed officers missed him. The truth was far more complicated. Beneath the surface, Horning's motives were not born of honor or rebellion, but of necessity. He stole because he had to, and he mocked the police because it gave him a sense of control. By late June, Danny Ray Horning had been on the run for more than a month. The heat of the Arizona summer had deepened, the air turning dry and metallic, and the pine forests of the north gave him just enough cover to keep the search alive without ever bringing it to an end. To most fugitives, this would have been the point of exhaustion, but to Horning it was an awakening. The chase had become a kind of theater, and he had begun to imagine himself as the director. The decision to head toward the canyon was not impulsive. Over the preceding weeks, he had tested his limits, pushing deeper into the wilderness, studying the patrol patterns of the officers who hunted him, and watching the headlines that now covered his every move. He understood that his story had already captured the public's imagination, that people were following his escapes like episodes of an unfolding serial. He planned to use that attention as a means to an end. By mid-June, he had stolen a pickup truck near Pine, filled its bed with supplies, and driven east toward New Mexico, circling wide to throw off pursuit. When the car was spotted days later near Payson, he had already crossed back into Arizona. His movements were erratic, but never random. Each route was chosen to keep the FBI guessing, to waste their resources, and break their rhythm. Then, as they shifted their focus to the south and east, Horning turned quietly north again, passing through Flagstaff and into the high country that bordered the canyon. There, in the cool air above the rim, he began to form a plan. It was as reckless as it was ambitious. He would kidnap a wealthy family visiting the park, hold them hostage, and demand a ransom that would secure both his freedom and the release of his brother Jerry, who was serving his own sentence in Florence prison. To Horning, it was not simply an escape plan. It was proof of genius, the final move in a game that he believed he had been winning all along. The days that followed were filled with movement. He broke into homes and vacation cabins, gathering food and ammunition. He changed his appearance, shaving his beard and dyeing his hair a pale reddish blonde. He studied maps of the park, memorized roadways and trailheads, and spent hours watching tourists from a distance. He was not looking for victims. He was looking for an opportunity. On June 25th, he arrived in Flagstaff and began scouting potential targets. He watched the flow of traffic around the Little America Hotel, where large RVs and family campers often stopped for fuel. He believed a wealthy family could afford to pay the ransom he demanded, but his timing failed him. As he watched from across the street, a passing patrol officer noticed his nervous posture. For a moment, the two locked eyes, and Horning knew he had been recognized. He slipped into a nearby building to hide, only to discover smoke rising from another structure on the block. The fire drew the officer away, a coincidence that felt almost miraculous. Horning seized the distraction and escaped. Shaken but still determined, he left Flagstaff that evening and drove west along Interstate 40. Near the small town of Williams, he stopped to withdraw money from the bank accounts of a middle-aged couple he had carjacked hours earlier. Their names were Andrew Lackritz and Catherine Falk, residents of Flagstaff who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Terrified but unharmed, they obeyed his orders as he forced them to drive north toward the Grand Canyon. At the park entrance, as the sun sank behind the cliffs, Horning admired the view that stretched endlessly before him. That night, he checked into a room at the El Tovar Hotel, using his hostages to mask his identity. The next morning, he recorded his ransom demands on a small tape recorder, his voice level and composed. He asked for $1 million in cash, his own freedom, and the release of his brother. If his demands were not met, he said, the hostages would die. When he later spoke of those days, Horning described them with a strange sense of pride. He believed he was in control, that his intelligence and courage had placed him beyond the reach of the ordinary world. But the truth was that every step he took brought him closer to collapse. His movements were no longer guided by reason, but by the illusion that his own story could not end here. On the afternoon of June 26, the plan began to fall apart. In the parking lot of a general store near the canyon's south rim, Horning approached a family returning to their trailer after a long day of sightseeing. They were the Norman family, a father, mother, uncle, and 15-year-old son visiting from out of state. Pretending to admire their camper, Horning asked to take a look inside. Within seconds, the father realized what was happening. As Horning drew his gun, the son, sensing danger, ran to find a nearby park ranger. The boy's bravery changed everything. Within minutes, rangers arrived, guns drawn, confronting the fugitive as tourists scattered for cover. Horning fled to the couple's car, firing a single shot that missed its mark, and sped away from the scene. The chase that followed tore through the park's narrow roads as visitors ducked behind cars and rangers called for backup. When Horning's vehicle finally crashed near a trailhead, he abandoned it and vanished once again into the forest. The FBI had its answer now. Horning's intentions were no longer theoretical. He had attempted to kidnap a family in broad daylight, and he was armed, desperate, and willing to kill. In response, the Bureau decided without precedent in the park's 73-year history, the Grand Canyon would be closed to the public until Horning was caught. For the first time, America's most famous natural wonder became a sealed crime scene. That night, as helicopters swept the rim and rangers lit flares across the dark sky, the canyon felt different, less like a landscape and more like a trap. Somewhere below, or perhaps already miles away, the man they called the prison break genius was still moving, silent and invisible, into the next chapter of his story. This is how Danny Ray Horning's pursuit reached its most dangerous point, when the open spaces that once gave him freedom began to turn into the walls of another kind of prison. The order to close the Grand Canyon came before dawn. Rangers gathered at their posts, roadblocks were erected, and the entrances to one of the most visited natural landmarks in the world fell silent. The 4th of July weekend was approaching, a time when thousands of tourists were expected to flood the park. Instead, the parking lots were empty, the trails deserted, and the canyon echoed only with the distant whir of helicopter blades. Across the park, Agents worked in pairs, sweeping the rim and surrounding forests. Some rappelled into the canyon's vast crevices, searching caves and riverbanks for signs of movement. Tracker dogs picked up faint trails that dissolved with each gust of wind. The terrain was enormous, 1.2 million acres of rock and wilderness, and somewhere in it was a man who had spent weeks learning how to vanish. The search lasted for days. Then, on July 4, 1992, two British tourists preparing to leave the park saw a figure emerge from the trees near their car. The man was thinner than the photographs on the news, his face clean-shaven, his hair sun-bleached and pale, but there was no mistaking the look in his eyes. He carried a pistol and spoke quietly, ordering them to drive. It was Danny Ray Horning. They obeyed. At the roadblock, a ranger approached the car, his flashlight sweeping across the passengers. Horning sat perfectly still in the backseat, the gun hidden out of view. The woman forced a smile, answered the ranger's questions, and prayed he would not notice. After a brief exchange, the ranger waved them through, and the car rolled forward into the open highway. For 60 miles, they drove south toward the town of Williams. Horning was silent at first, scanning the road, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. When he finally spoke, it was to give his final order. He told the women to pull over on a quiet stretch of highway, and once they stopped, he stepped out of the car, raised his weapon, and motioned for them to get out. They believed they were about to die. Instead, he vanished into the forest, taking their car and leaving them trembling on the roadside. The women ran until they found a gas station and called for help. Within minutes, patrol cars flooded the area. The FBI now had its first confirmed sighting in days, and their first proof that Horning was becoming desperate. Later that night, a state trooper named Stephen Costello spotted the stolen car speeding down Highway 89 toward Sedona. He began to follow at a distance. The chase was quiet at first, just two sets of headlights carving through the desert dark. Then came a sharp crack, a gunshot that shattered the patrol car's windshield. Costello ducked, feeling the rush of air from the bullet that missed him by inches. He radioed for backup, still following, unwilling to let go. The pursuit ended near an exit ramp outside Sedona, where Horning lost control and skidded into a road sign. The car jerked to a stop. Before the officer could react, Horning jumped out, disappeared into the trees, and left the sound of crickets and engines fading behind him. Night fell. Search teams moved in, sweeping the area with dogs and floodlights. Hours later, a resident called to report a man drinking from a garden hose behind his house. A Border Patrol agent arrived quietly, weapon drawn, and found Horning lying flat on the ground, his shirt soaked with sweat and dust. After 54 days on the run, hundreds of miles crossed, and an entire national park brought to a standstill, Danny Ray Horning surrendered without a fight. He was too weak to resist, too tired to run. The man who had once dared the court to keep him locked up, who had walked through a maximum security prison as if it were a doorway, and who had turned the Arizona wilderness into a personal kingdom, was finally done. He was returned to custody and later extradited to California to stand trial for the murder of Sam McCullough, the man whose dismembered body had first started it all. The evidence was overwhelming, and after 2 weeks of proceedings, the jury reached its verdict in just a few hours. On July 15, 1994, Danny Ray Horning was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. He was transferred to San Quentin Prison, where he remains under maximum security, confined to the very cell block reserved for California's most dangerous inmates. This is how the myth of the prison break genius finally ended, not with the roar of helicopters or the gunfire of a final stand, but with the quiet surrender of a man who had run out of ground to escape to.